Back in January, NPR's This American Life released an episode concerning the words that you can and cannot use in various social movements. Although much of the episode focused on an issue in the Republican Party concerning gun control, the general push of the episode was primarily concerned with this issue as it applied to the left. This isn't exactly out of nowhere. This kind of language policing is incredibly associated with the left. Most of the episode focused on an incident concerning Laci Green that for most of the internet probably feels like ancient history. But for the uninitiated, basically what happened was Laci Green is a sex educator and feminist who's been making videos for quite some time. For a long time though, she's been receiving a lot of criticism from transgender activists and their allies concerning the language that she uses to refer to genitals, among other things. For Green, this led to a pretty consistent stream of harassment. And in what many on the left would consider an ultimate faux pas, she ended up reaching out to the right-wing YouTube community. Ultimately, she ended up releasing a video claiming that she had been red-pilled. And today, while she maintains that she's a feminist, Green is dating a very prominent anti-feminist YouTuber and dismisses a large chunk of the social justice community as extremists. For anyone who spends any amount of time in leftist circles on the internet, this probably sounds pretty familiar. The left, especially on the internet, is well known for its ideological purity campaigns as well as its call-out culture. Despite the perception by those making the argument that ideological purity on the left goes too far, that this is some sort of controversial argument, it tends to be the overwhelmingly popular view. Language on the internet left moves incredibly quickly, and it's really easy to get left behind. And the language around gender seems to be especially confounding, with even many people on the left often making mistakes. And surely, even if we maintain that language is important, doesn't it seem a little bit messed up to boot somebody out of the community over a minor mistake or minor disagreement? Almost certainly, yeah. But of course that begs the question. If this is so bad for building movements, why do so many leftists do it anyway? Are they all just shrieking harpies, desperate for any moral high ground that they can exploit to appear to be the most woke? Almost certainly, yeah, some of them, I'd say. I've definitely met people like that. But it seems a little bit disingenuous to just dismiss all of them like that. After all, ultimately what's usually going on here is that there are some issues that are considered too controversial or too niche to risk alienating mainstream audiences. To go back to Green for a moment, one of the main issues surrounding her was the words that she used as a sex educator to describe genitalia. Originally, she used male and female, but eventually after pressure from transgender activists, she switched to the admittedly clunky penis haver and vagina haver. And according to Green, even this didn't stop the outrage. To the average outside observer, this probably all seems pretty ridiculous. I mean, why not just keep using male and female? It gets the point across, and after all, don't scientists use male and female to refer to transgender people anyway? I mean, are we really going to change our language this much just to protect a small group of people from reality? But is this really even the issue? I mean, it's not as though transgender people aren't already intimately aware of what genitals they have. It's not like there's any sort of reality they're actually being protected from in that situation. While I can't say for sure what Green's critics were thinking, right off the bat I can think of a pretty practical and reasonable reason for them to want her to make the language shift. Just the simple reality of transgender people's bodies. The simple fact is that transgender people who have begun any sort of medical intervention, even as simple as taking hormones, have bodies that are incredibly different from cisgender people. If you take a transgender man, for example, who's begun hormone replacement therapy, he may have a vagina like a cisgender woman, but it may look and act incredibly differently. Incidentally, this is probably why the genital havers model that Green proposed didn't work out as well as she might have hoped. In my opinion, there eventually just comes a time when an educator just has to admit where their blind spots are, and if some information they're giving might not apply to all people. But regardless, to me it seems a bit reasonable to not want uninformed transgender teens wandering around thinking information applies to them wherein it very well may not. This is likely to be harmless most of the time, but it could have some unforeseen consequences. And honestly, if I were a sex educator, I would try to avoid that sort of thing. Now let me be really clear. The threats and harassment that Green received were unacceptable and indefensible. But that doesn't mean that the arguments informing them were entirely unreasonable. There's often a similar depth to other issues that are considered to be too much. And often, much like with transgender people, the groups that bring forth these issues don't have mainstream acceptance. Women's issues, for instance, don't receive the same kind of dismissal from more centrist social justice factions. After all, it's considered worth convincing mainstream audiences of women's issues, no matter how controversial. Even something like rape culture, which is considered incredibly controversial, is not tossed aside for the sake of more mainstream audiences. And of course, the disabled people, transgender people, non-binary people, and intersex people see this happening. And what they tend to perceive is that they've joined a group that they thought was going to fight for their rights, and instead find themselves cast aside just for optics. It's honestly hard to blame them for being upset. Civil rights and social justice movements have had these issues forever. Even going back as far as the women's suffrage movement, Black women were thrown under the bus in favor of garnering support from Southern white women. The main difference now is that these groups have unprecedented access to platforms through the internet, and so when they feel that they're cast aside, they can express their anger. And in some cases, the more volatile factions will even resort to harassment campaigns as a result. So in as far as this issue of does the left cannibalize itself goes, I'd say the answer is a pretty clear yeah, for the most part. And going forward, I think the biggest thing the social justice left needs to do is to be more ready to let people fail, and to be ready to have minor disagreements. That's the only way that we can have any sort of growth going forward. We can have it both ways, I think. Maybe instead of dropping more controversial groups and issues for the sake of mainstream acceptance, we can be ready to forgive people when they slip up, and be ready to teach people when the time comes. And yeah, a lot of people are pretty sick of teaching. They're sick of their lives being turned into teaching experiences for everyone's. And that's okay, not everybody has to be a teacher. But let's not pretend that refusing to do so, and instead choosing to berate those who are ignorant, ever gave anyone any kind of moral high ground. Thank you for tuning in to see my first video. This is the first time I've ever had to edit anything, so hopefully it didn't turn out too crudely. You should be seeing some video ideas scrolling by right now for things that I'd like to do in the future. So hopefully if any of them pique your interest, I'll see you next time.